At exactly 12:01 in the morning on March 13th, something changed in your wallet. You did not feel it yet. You were probably asleep. But somewhere between midnight and right now, Canada flipped a switch and $20 billion worth of American exports began getting taxed at 25% on their way into Canadian markets. Steel, aluminum, computers, sports equipment, cast iron, tools. A list so long and so specific that economic analysts spent the morning counting categories instead of sleeping. And the reason this matters to you, sitting right now in an American city or town, is not what Canada is paying. It is what you are about to pay. Because this is not the beginning of the story. It is the escalation of a trade war that has been building for 43 days, moving faster than most Americans have been able to track, and quietly rearranging the price of almost everything you buy that is made of metal, assembled in a factory, or transported across a border. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what changed at midnight, why it happened, what comes next, and why the people running American manufacturing are more frightened right now than they have been at any point in the last decade. Let's start with what actually happened today, because the numbers matter. On March 12th, the United States government imposed a 25% tariff on all Canadian steel and aluminum entering the country. Not a threat, not a warning. An actual tariff, signed and active. Canada is the largest supplier of steel and aluminum to the United States, accounting for 23% of all American steel imports and somewhere between 60 and 70% of all American aluminum imports, depending on which dataset you use. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not a liberal institution and is not sympathetic to Canada's position, put it plainly in a report published this week. 70% of American aluminum imports come from Canada. It has been that way for a century. American manufacturers built entire production systems around it. There is no domestic replacement available. Canada's response came within hours. Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc announced that as of 12:01 a.m. on March 13th, Canada would impose 25% retaliatory tariffs on 29.8 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods coming into Canada. That translates to roughly 20 billion US dollars. The breakdown is precise. 12.6 billion in American steel products, 3 billion in American aluminum, and 14.2 billion in additional American goods including computers, servers, display monitors, sports equipment, and cast iron products. These are not random items. Every category on that list was chosen specifically because it hits American exporters where they are most exposed and because it maximizes pressure on American industries that lobbied for this tariff in the first place. And Minister LeBlanc said something else at that press conference that nobody in Washington has adequately responded to. He said this is a dollar-for-dollar response. Canada is not escalating beyond what the United States imposed. It is matching it exactly. That framing matters because it puts the next move entirely on Trump, and Trump's record on next moves in this trade war has been, to put it diplomatically, unpredictable. Here is the background you need to understand why this moment is different from every previous escalation. The trade war between the United States and Canada began on February 1st, when President Trump signed executive orders imposing a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy and potash, citing what the White House described as an extraordinary threat from illegal immigration and narcotics flows across the northern border. Canadian officials, including then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, called the justification absurd. Canada's share of fentanyl seized at the U.S. border is approximately 1%. The vast majority comes through the southern border. But the tariffs went ahead anyway. Canada responded within days with retaliatory measures on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American imports. Trump partially backed down. Then he escalated again. Then he backed down again. In a period of 6 weeks, the tariff situation between the United States and Canada changed direction so many times that the Wall Street Journal published a guide to help American businesses track what was and was not currently taxed on any given day. The S&P 500 dropped 9% from its February 14th peak. The Nasdaq fell 13%. European stock markets, by contrast, had their strongest run in 15 years. Analysts at The Economist attributed the American sell-off directly to the unpredictability of Trump's trade policies. And then, on March 11th, something happened that pushed this specific escalation over the edge. Ontario, Canada's largest province, threatened to impose a 25% tariff on electricity it exports to 3 American states, Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. Those 3 states depend on Canadian hydroelectric power for a portion of their grid. Trump's response was to double the steel and aluminum tariff from 25 to 50% within hours. Ontario suspended its electricity tariff threat. Trump reduced the steel tariff back to 25%. This happened in less than 48 hours. This is the context in which the midnight tariffs on March 13th arrived. Now let's talk about what this actually costs. The Ford F-150 is the best-selling vehicle in America. It has been for decades. It is assembled in Dearborn, Michigan, and Kansas City, Missouri, which means it is, by every definition, an American-made truck. But the body of the F-150 is made primarily from aluminum. High-strength, military-grade, aerospace-quality aluminum. And according to research from Barclays cited by the Wall Street Journal, roughly 75% of the primary aluminum used to build that truck comes from Canada, specifically from smelters in Quebec powered by abundant and cheap hydroelectric power. There is a reason for that. Aluminum smelting requires enormous amounts of electricity. It is sometimes called congealed electricity because the energy cost is built directly into the metal. American electricity prices have risen approximately 40% in the last 5 years. Canadian hydropower is abundant, clean, and cheap. That is why American automakers built their aluminum supply chains around Canada. It was not ideology. It was economics. With a 25% tariff now active on Canadian aluminum, Barclays estimates the added material cost per vehicle at approximately $400. Experts at U.S. News called it conservative, noting that when you account for all affected parts and components across the full supply chain, average vehicle price increases across all makes and models could reach $3,000 per vehicle. Ford alone absorbed $900 million in tariff costs in the second half of 2025, according to a detailed financial report published 3 weeks ago. The company had already paid out billions the year before. Toyota, the world's largest automaker, told CNBC in an email this week that the tariffs are highly disruptive and cannot be sustained. Toyota's net income fell 25% in the first 9 months of its current fiscal year. The tariff cost to Toyota alone was roughly $8 billion. And the news for American consumers gets worse from here because Canada's supply is not easily replaced. The United States currently produces only about 16% of the aluminum it needs domestically. That number comes not from a Canadian source or an environmental group, but from Canada's own industry minister François-Philippe Champagne, who stated it publicly at Wednesday's press conference as a warning to Washington. The last new aluminum smelter built in the United States was constructed more than 40 years ago. A new facility under development in Oklahoma, which would be only the second built in this country in nearly half a century, is not expected to be operational until 2030. And even the funding to secure its electrical power supply is not yet complete. The president of Alcoa, America's largest domestic aluminum producer, has publicly questioned the optimistic timelines being offered by the White House for rebuilding domestic capacity. In the meantime, when Canadian aluminum is unavailable or too expensive, American manufacturers have to source it from somewhere else. That somewhere else is primarily from seaborne imports crossing the Pacific. Longer shipping routes, higher freight costs, more complex supply chains, less reliability, higher prices for every downstream American product that contains aluminum, from beer cans to Boeing aircraft to the trucks in your neighborhood to the appliances in your kitchen. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has historically supported Republican trade policy and whose membership includes the largest corporations in America, published a formal statement this week that said in plain terms, "These tariffs are making American industry less competitive, not more." The chamber specifically called for an end to the Canadian aluminum tariffs, noting that Canada was not just a trading partner, but was declared by Congress to be an integral part of the U.S. defense industrial base under the Defense Production Act in 1993. Canada provided 40% of all Allied aluminum production during World War II. This is not a recent or casual relationship. It is a century-old industrial partnership that is now being taxed at 25%. There is a third layer to this story that most coverage has missed, and it is the one that will matter most 6 months from now. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020 and governs nearly all trade between the three North American economies, is scheduled for its mandatory review in the summer of 2026. Prime Minister Carney, who was officially sworn in on March 14th and whose first public speech focused entirely on the tariff crisis, has already declared the agreement effectively broken in the short term due to U.S. actions. Trump, for his part, described the USMCA as irrelevant at a recent speech to the Detroit Economic Club after having called it the fairest and most beneficial trade agreement ever signed just 6 years ago. The USMCA covers an economy of roughly $1.9 trillion in annual goods and services trade. It underpins the supply chains for automobiles, agriculture, energy, technology, and defense. The American automotive industry alone cannot function without it. General Motors and Stellantis import approximately a third of their assembled vehicles from Canadian and Mexican plants. Honda, Nissan, Toyota, Volkswagen, Mazda, and Volvo all have significant assembly operations in Canada and Mexico. Every single one of those vehicles, and every part that crosses the border to build them, is now subject to shifting, unpredictable tariff policies that the president of one of America's largest auto dealership groups described this month as too high to sustain. He was not speaking hypothetically. He said on his company's earnings call, "Prices are already going up. It is already happening. And Canadian businesses are making decisions right now that the United States will feel for years." According to Global News, the number of Canadian companies that sell exclusively to the United States has been cut nearly in half since the trade war began. 65% of Canadian exporters surveyed said they are actively pursuing new markets outside the U.S., with a target of completing those transitions within 2 years. Quebec's aluminum industry, which sent 95% of its production to American buyers as recently as last year, redirected significant volumes to Europe during the second quarter of 2025. And European buyers have since signed long-term supply contracts to lock in that Canadian material. Those contracts do not get undone easily. Every month that this trade war continues is a month in which Canadian producers build new commercial relationships with buyers in Europe, Asia, and South America, and reduce their structural dependence on American customers. Canada's finance ministry underscored this trajectory by selling $3.5 billion in American Treasury bonds to investors this week. That is not a catastrophic number in the context of global bond markets, but it is a signal. It is a government saying publicly and financially that its exposure to American assets is something it is actively managing. The message was received. Bond traders noted the sale. Currency analysts wrote about it. It was a quiet, methodical, entirely deliberate statement of economic intent from a country that for 80 years has been America's closest and most reliable trading partner. Here is where things stand right now. Canada has just imposed $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs that took effect at midnight. The WTO has formally received Canada's request to use international dispute resolution mechanisms against the United States for violations of the 1994 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. 46 American senators have written to demand answers about the direction of trade policy. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has called for a reversal of the aluminum tariffs. Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Toyota have collectively absorbed billions in tariff costs and warned that consumer prices are increasing. The average new car in America now costs close to $50,000, and there is no new car on an American lot priced below $20,000. That price floor did not used to exist. And the USMCA review is 5 months away, with no substantive trade negotiations currently scheduled between the United States and Canada, a fact confirmed this week by the American ambassador to Canada himself. The $20 billion that Canada fired back with at midnight is not just a number. It is a data point in a much larger calculation that every American business importing or exporting across the northern border is running right now. The calculation is simple. How much longer can we absorb this before we start losing customers, cutting workers, or raising prices? For Ford, that calculation already produced $900 million in losses in a single quarter. For the average American buying a truck, a refrigerator, a beer, or a house with aluminum windows, the answer to that calculation is showing up on price tags that keep moving in one direction. The trade war between the United States and Canada is not a story about two governments arguing over policy. It is a story about the most integrated industrial relationship in the world being systematically dismantled, 25% at a time, with no clear endgame and no negotiating table currently set. And it started being felt in your wallet at 12:01 this morning.